Hello everybody, welcome to another video today. My name is Chris, and today we do have some breaking news to go over. That's right, over 500 Jo-Ann Fabric stores will be closing, and this is the closing list as of Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. So we have a lot of closings. It is approximately 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of store closings, or stores that are rather closing. So unfortunately it was announced this is over 500 Jo-Ann Fabrics and craft stores that will be closing. So it is a lot of stores that are going to be closing. I expect them to start liquidation sales by tomorrow. And again, these were announced today by the United States Bankruptcy Court. So again, very sad. So let's go over the list of the following Jo-Ann Fabric stores that will be closing as of Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. So, we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Anchorage, Alaska, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Juneau, Alaska, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Florence, Alabama, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Montgomery, Alabama, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Jonesboro, Arkansas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in North Little Rock, Arkansas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Flagstaff, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Bullhead City, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store, two of them in Phoenix, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Avondale, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mesa, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Casa Grande, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Queen Creek, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Phoenix, Arizona, that's a third one, the Jo-Ann Fabric Stores in Tucson, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabrics in Green Valley, Arizona, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Bakersfield, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Chico, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fresno, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Long Beach, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in La Verne, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Huntington Beach, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Alhambra, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in La Canada, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lakewood, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Torrance, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Northridge, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Buena Park, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Irvine, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Woodland Hills, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Glendale, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fullerton, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Santa Clarita, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Orange, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Foot Ranch, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sherman Oaks, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Turlock, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Eureka, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sonoria, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Jackson, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Oxnard, California, the Jo-Ann Fabrics in Simi Valley, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Redding, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Corona, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Missoula, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Redlands, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Rancho Mirage, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hasaparia, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Riverside, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hemet, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Chino, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sacramento, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Woodland, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Elk Grove, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Folsom, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Curtis Heights, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Salinas, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Oceanside, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Poway, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in San Diego, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in San Marcos, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Corte Madera, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in San Mateo, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Redwood City, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Concord, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in El Cerrito, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dublin, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in San Leandro, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dolly City, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cupertino, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Morgan Hill, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Santa Rosa, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Ronette Park, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mantesia, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Stockton, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Vacaville, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Yuba City, California, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Boulder, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Aurora, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sentinel, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store, the second one in Aurora, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Loveland, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Pueblo, Colorado, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Brookfield, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Manchester, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Newington, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Enfield, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Southington, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hamden, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Milford, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Torring, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Torwich, Connecticut, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dover, Delaware, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Newark, Delaware, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fort Myers, Florida, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store Store in Estoril, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Dayton Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Jacksonville, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Yulee, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Lakeland, Florida, total of 3 Joann Fabric Stores in Miami, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Pompeo Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Hollywood, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Boynton Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Margate, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Wellington, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Pembroke Pines, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Plantation, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in West Palm Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Naples, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Sarasota, Florida, the Joann Fabric Stores in Venice, Florida, the Joann Fabric Stores in Ocalalia, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Lady Lake, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Orlando, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Altamonte Springs, Florida, another Joann Fabrics in Orlando, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Kissimmee, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Sanford, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Winter Green, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Vero Beach, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Spring Hill, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Port Richey, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store, 2 of them in Tampa, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in St. Petersburg, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Dunedin, Florida, the Joann Fabric Store in Athens, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Douglasville, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Duluth, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Alpharetta, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Sinellyville, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Fayetteville, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Conrays, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Newman, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Cumming, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Brunswick, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Macomb, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Warner Robins, Georgia, the Joann Fabric Store in Ames, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Nikki, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Iowa City, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Mustang, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Mason City, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Council Bluffs, Iowa, the Joann Fabric Store in Boise, Idaho, the Joann Fabric Store, Joann Fabric Store in Moscow, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Champaign, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Crestwood, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Wheaton, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Niles, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Northridge, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Countryside, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Naperville, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Bloomington, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Vernon Hills, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Giovanna, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Orland Park, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Arlington Heights, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Chicago, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Gillette, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Machinery, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Chicago, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Alagoquin, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Danville, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Moline, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Quincy, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Carbondale, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Galesburg, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Sterling, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Peru, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Freeport, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Mattoon, Illinois, the Joann Fabric Store in Bloomington, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Sherryville, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Maryville, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Columbus, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Goshen, Indiana, the two Joann Fabric Stores in Indianapolis, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Como, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Clarksville, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Michigan City, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Machine, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Maroon, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Richmond, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Plymouth, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Venice, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Gullia, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Bedford, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Jasper, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Mishawaka, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in South Bend, Indiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Lawrence, Kansas, the Joann Fabric Store in Salina, Kansas, the Joann Fabric Store in Ithaca, Kansas, the Joann Fabric Store in Florence, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Ashland, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Corbin, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Glasgow, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Owensboro, Kentucky, the Joann Fabric Store in Alexandria, Louisiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Slidell, Louisiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Gratina, Louisiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Mentorine, Louisiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Shiverport, Louisiana, the Joann Fabric Store in Hyannis, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Middleton, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Hanover, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Natick, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Westford, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Burlington, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in North Billerica, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Metuchen, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Saginaw, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in East Walpole, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Renham, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store, the Joann Fabric Store in Seacock, Seekonok, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Liddell, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Howling, Massachusetts, the Joann Fabric Store in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, and the Joann Fabric Store in Leominster, Massachusetts. Then we have the Joann Fabric Store in Westminster, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Columbia, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Bel Air, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Parkville, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Laville, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Hagerstown, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in California, Maryland, the Joann and Fabric Stores in Gaithersburg, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Greenbelt, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Frederick, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Brandywine, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Prince Frederick, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Wheaton, Maine, the Joann Fabric Store in Auburn, Wheaton, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Prince Frederick, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Brandywine, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Greenbelt, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Greenbelt, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Gaithersburg, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in California, Maryland, Joann Fabric Store in Prince Frederick, Maryland, Joann Fabric Store in Wheaton, Maryland, the Joann Fabric Store in Auburn, Maine, the Joann Fabric Store in Waterville, Maine, the Joann Fabric Store in Topsham, Maine, the Joann Fabric Store in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Yesapalante, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Battle Creek, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Essexville, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Fort Gertott, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Canton, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Madison Heights, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Lapeer, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Shelby Township, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Novi, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Roseville, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Taylor, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Auburn Hills, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Burlington, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Rochester Hills, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Allen Park, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Chesterfield, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Burton, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Flint, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Granville, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Holland, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Jackson, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Lansing, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Lorton Shores, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Benton Harbor, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Ardenne, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Midland, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Alpena, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Petoskey, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Big Rapids, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Saginaw, Michigan, the Joann Fabric Store in Hibberg, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Mantico, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store Heidelberg, Minnesota, Mantico, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Woodbury, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Maple Grove, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Apple Valley, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store Coon Rapids, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store Apple Valley, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Elk River, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Shakopee, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Hutchinson, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Benji, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Wilmar, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Faribault, Minnesota, and Benji, Minnesota, and Hutchinson, Minnesota, the Joann Fabric Store in Jefferson City, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Independence, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Belton, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in St. Joseph, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Baldwin, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Crystal City, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Washington, Missouri, the Joann Fabric Store in Jackson, Mississippi, the Joann Fabric Store in Topeka, Mississippi, the Joann Fabric Store in Butte, Montana, and the Joann Fabric Store in Helena, Montana. Then we have the Joann Fabric Store in Asheville, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Hendersonville, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Goldsboro, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Morganton, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Mooresville, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Rockmount, North Carolina, the Joann Fabric Store in Grand Forks, North Dakota, the Joann Fabric Store in Bellevue, Nebraska, I believe. The Joann Fabric Stores in Newington, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Stores in Seabrook, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in Rochester, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in Nashua, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in Belmont, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in Concord, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in West Lebanon, New Hampshire, the Joann Fabric Store in Mays Landing, New Jersey, the Joann Fabric Store in Succoquasina, New Jersey, the Joann Fabric Store in Toms River, New Jersey, the Joann Fabric Store in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, the Joann Fabric Store in Deptford, New Jersey, and the Joann Fabric Store in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Wow, no North Jersey closings. That is quite surprising. The Joann Fabric Store in La Cruz, New Mexico, the Joann Fabric Store in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Joann Fabric Store in Carson City, Nevada, the Joann Fabric Store in Elko, Nevada, the Joann Fabric Store in Clifton Park, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Albany, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Niagara Falls, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Amherst, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Bladsdell, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Williamsville, New York, the Joann Fabric Store in Horse Sheds, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Kingston, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Westbury, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in West Babylon, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Scarsdale, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lakewood, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cortland, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Amsterdam, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Malone, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Olean, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Watertown, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hudson, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Middletown, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Poughkeepsie, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store 2 in Rochester, New York, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Canandaigua, New York, and the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fayetteville, New York. Then we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store, 2 of them in Akron, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Evendale, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mason, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hamilton, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Medina, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in North Olmsted, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Maysfield Heights, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lancaster, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Columbus, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dublin, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Columbus, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Columbus, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dearborn, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dayton, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lima, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in East Liverpool, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fremont, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Chillicothe, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in New Philadelphia, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Defiance, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Athens, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Findlay, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Marietta, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sandusky, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Springfield, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Steubenville, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in St. Clairsville, Ohio, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Niles, Ohio, and the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Youngstown, Ohio. Then we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lawton, Oklahoma, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Stillwater, Oklahoma, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Then we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Redmond, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Coralville, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Springfield, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Albany, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lincoln City, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in New Delis, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in North Bend, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Wharton, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Grant Pass, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Klamath Falls, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in McMinnville, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Oregon City, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hillsboro, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Beaverton, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Clackamas, Oregon, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Whitehall, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Altaloonie, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lamani, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Johnsontown, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Meadville, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Du Bois, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Indiana, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sills Grove, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Waynetown, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Quakertown, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in North Wales, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Springfield, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Warrington, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Butler, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Belvern, Pennsylvania, 2 Jo-Ann Fabric Stores in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cranberry Township, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Reading, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dixon City, Pennsylvania, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in State College, Pennsylvania, and finally the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hanover, Pennsylvania. And then in Rhode Island, we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Warwick, Rhode Island. So we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Anderson, South Carolina, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Charleston, South Carolina, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Columbia, South Carolina, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Florence, South Carolina, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Spartanburg, South Carolina, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Brookings, South Dakota. We have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Clarksville, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Jackson, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Johnson City, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Kingsport, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Knoxville, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Germantown, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Franklin, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sayreville, Tennessee, and finally we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Tullahoma, Tennessee. In Texas, it's going to be a lot, so brace yourselves. So we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Abilene, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Austin, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Dallas, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hurst, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Arlington, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Rockwell, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Denton, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Midlothian, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Louisville, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mesquite, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Houston, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Caddy, Texas, 2 additional Jo-Ann Fabric Stores in Houston, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Pharr, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Odessa, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in San Antonio, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sherman, Texas, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Clinton, Utah, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Tully, Utah, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Salt Lake City, Utah. Then we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Christiansburg, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lynchburg, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Martinsville, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Culpeper, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hampton, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hampton, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Williamsburg, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Virginia Beach, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Falls Church, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Wharton, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fairfax, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Woodbridge, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Rutlandtown, Vermont, and the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Barre, Vermont. Then in Washington State, we have the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Silverdale, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Clarkstown, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Longview, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Mount Vernon, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Port Angeles, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Walla Walla, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Moses Lake, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Kent, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Everett, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Renton, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Shoreline, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Seattle, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Federal Way, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Tukwila, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Puyallup, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Linwood, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Tacoma, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Arlington, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Spokane, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Spokane Valley, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in East Wenatchee, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Janesville, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Madison, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Pewaukee, Washington, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cudahy, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Brookfield, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Menomonee Falls, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Watertown, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Lake Giovanna, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Marshfield, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Monterey, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Richer, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Berkeley, West Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Parkersburg, West Virginia, the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and I guess the Jo-Ann Fabric Store in Hudson, Ohio was a last-minute addition. So, guys, that is every single Jo-Ann Fabric Store that will be closing. Again, this was just filed today, so this is literally breaking news. This is the Jo-Ann Fabrics closing list as of Wednesday, February 12th of 2024. I will make sure to include the link in the description below. I want to sincerely thank you guys for watching this video, and that will be it.